Berlin, February 18th, 1944. The air above the German capital shimmered with the pale light of a late winter morning. For a moment, the city seemed at peace. No sirens, no gunfire, only the hum of daily life under a war that had become routine. And then the sky split open. Two small twin-engine aircraft came tearing through the clouds at treetop level so low that the rooftops shook as they passed. Their silver fuselages flashed in the cold sunlight, their engines screaming like angry hornets. The soldiers on the ground froze. These weren't the heavy bombers they knew, not the lumbering Lancasters or Halifaxes that the Luftwaffe had grown used to hunting. These were smaller, faster, and stranger. Before anyone could react, the first aircraft dropped two bombs with astonishing precision. The blast tore through Berlin's main radio station, sending shards of glass and concrete into the streets. Seconds later, the second plane followed its payload, slamming into the Gestapo headquarters itself. The German capital had just been hit in broad daylight by aircraft that radar hadn't even detected. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, they were gone. No one saw them coming. No one could catch them. Only smoke and disbelief remained. Within hours, word reached Hermann Göring, the commander of the Luftwaffe. Furious and humiliated, he demanded to know how such an attack was even possible. How could a pair of British bombers fly into Berlin in daylight and escape untouched? When he learned the truth, his rage turned to disbelief. The bombers that had humiliated him, that had made the Luftwaffe look blind and powerless, were not made of metal. They were made of wood. The aircraft's name was the de Havilland Mosquito. Just 3 years earlier, even the British government had laughed at the idea. A bomber made out of plywood and glue, with no guns, no armor, and no escorts. It sounded like suicide. But Geoffrey de Havilland, a quiet engineer with a fierce sense of vision, believed otherwise. He argued that armor and weapons added weight, and weight meant death. His theory was brutally simple: speed is armor. By stripping away everything that slowed a bomber down, he believed he could create something that no enemy could ever touch, not because it could fight back, but because it would simply outrun death. It was a philosophy that no one at the Air Ministry believed in. But Britain was desperate, and metal was running out. So while German factories churned out planes made of steel and arrogance, a handful of British craftsmen began building something very different, a machine of wood glue and genius. The first Mosquito flew in late 1940, and it was faster than anything else in the sky. Faster than the Spitfire, faster than any German fighter. By 1943, it had become the RAF's most extraordinary secret, a plane that could fly from England to Berlin, deliver its bombs with surgical precision, and be home before the sirens had even stopped wailing. It was quiet, elegant, and unstoppable. German radar couldn't track it. Their fighters couldn't catch it. The Luftwaffe began calling it the Wooden Ghost. To their horror, it was living up to the name. When Göring saw the reports of yet another daylight raid carried out by mosquitoes, this time on Berlin itself, he is said to have shouted in anger, "It makes me green with envy. They have the genius and we have the engineers." He wasn't wrong. That morning over Berlin marked more than just another air raid. It marked the moment when a wooden airplane born from desperation and imagination proved that innovation could humiliate tyranny. The Reich's mightiest air defenses had been defeated not by brute strength, but by British ingenuity carved from wood. And from that day on, the Luftwaffe would never again sleep easy under its own skies. England, late 1939. The country was tired, anxious, and unprepared for another war. Factories that once built cars and furniture were now producing rifles and spare parts for Spitfires. Aluminum was vanishing, steel was rationed, and the Royal Air Force was desperate for bombers that could reach deep into German territory. In the middle of this storm stood a quiet engineer named Geoffrey de Havilland, a man who believed that the future of flight belonged not to brute force, but to elegance. While others designed heavy aircraft covered in armor and bristling with gun turrets, he imagined something radically different. a bomber that relied on speed, not weapons, to survive. When he presented the idea to the Air Ministry, the reaction was laughter. A wooden airplane with no guns? Impossible. De Havilland listened in silence, then said softly, "If it's fast enough, it won't need guns." The logic was flawless on paper, but absurd to military minds trained to believe that strength meant metal and firepower. Britain had just survived the Battle of Britain by clinging to its Spitfire's nimble-armed metallic machines that had defended the island. Why would anyone risk resources on an unarmed wooden plane? Still, de Havilland persisted. He offered to build the prototype himself with his own company's money if the government would at least supply the engines. Reluctantly, they agreed. And so began one of the strangest construction projects of the entire war. Across England, furniture makers, piano, craftsmen, and cabinet builders left their workshops to join the effort. The smell of varnish and sawdust replaced the scent of oil and gunpowder. In small factories tucked behind blackout curtains, men who had once carved violins now shaped the curved fuselage of an aircraft. They layered birch, spruce, and balsa wood, bonding each sheet with resin until it became stronger than aluminum. The halves of the fuselage were built like two giant canoe shells, then joined down the center with meticulous precision. The result was smooth, light, and astonishingly durable. Every curve of the plane was handmade. Every inch carried the touch of a craftsman who believed, perhaps without fully knowing it, that art itself could be a weapon. While German factories thundered with steel and fire, British carpenters were building the weapon that would outfly the Reich with nothing more than wood glue and genius. By December 1940, the prototype was ready. A cold wind swept across the runway at Hatfield Aerodrome as Geoffrey de Havilland Jr., the designer's son, climbed into the cockpit. His father watched silently from the ground, hands clasped behind his back. The engines roared to life, two Rolls-Royce Merlin 21 seconds, the same power plants that carried the Spitfire into battle. The Mosquito accelerated down the runway, its wooden frame vibrating, then lifted effortlessly into the gray English sky. Within seconds, it disappeared into the clouds. When the stopwatch stopped, the results stunned everyone present. Top speed over 380 miles per hour, faster than the latest Spitfire, faster than any German fighter known at the time. The impossible had just flown. Word spread quickly through the RAF. The wooden joke had become the fastest operational aircraft in the world. By early 1941, production orders began pouring in. De Havilland's team refined the design, adding reconnaissance cameras, bomb bays, and navigation systems. Every version remained light, sleek, and absurdly fast. The Mosquito could carry a 4,000-pound bomb load, the same as the much larger American B-17, yet it required only 2 men and burned half the fuel. It could fly higher than German flak batteries could reach and lower than radar could detect. Pilots adored it. It was responsive, alive, almost human in its precision. Flying the Mosquito, one RAF veteran recalled, felt like strapping on a pair of wings. But what truly shocked military planners was its versatility. In a single day, a Mosquito could photograph enemy positions at Dawn Bomb, a submarine base, by noon, and deliver intelligence film to London before nightfall. No other aircraft in the world could do that. Still, skepticism lingered inside the British High Command. Traditionalists couldn't accept that something so fragile-looking could survive the brutality of war. They called it the carpenter's folly. That skepticism vanished after the first combat missions. Mosquitoes raided Gestapo headquarters in Oslo and The Hague with pinpoint accuracy. They destroyed railway lines, radar stations, and power plants, often in daylight without escort. They were too fast to stop, too agile to predict. German pilots began to dread the sound of twin Merlins roaring just above the treetops. The Luftwaffe's elite squadrons tried everything: ambushes, new radar frequencies, heavier flak, but nothing worked. What had started as a desperate experiment in a wooden workshop had turned into one of the most feared aircraft of the entire war. By 1943, the Mosquito had become more than just a bomber. It was a symbol of British defiance, a reminder that imagination could outfly oppression. While Germany built bigger, heavier, and more complicated machines, the Allies had built something pure, a weapon born not from industry but from creativity. For Geoffrey de Havilland, it was a personal vindication. The world had called his idea insane. Now his wooden miracle was changing the course of the air war, and soon its daring raids would make even the walls of Berlin tremble. By the spring of 1942, the laughter had stopped. Across occupied Europe, the Germans had a new enemy, one that they couldn't see coming, couldn't lock on radar, and couldn't catch once it struck. At first, they didn't even believe the reports. German radar operators described small echoes moving impossibly fast, vanishing before fighter patrols could intercept. Commanders dismissed them as instrument errors until the explosion started. Railway depots shattered. Power stations went dark. Gestapo headquarters burst into flame. The ghost in the sky had a name now, the Mosquito. Each mission was a test of nerve. The Mosquito's pilots flew lower than any aircraft was meant to fly, sometimes just a few meters above treetops, so low they could smell the forests rushing beneath them. Their speed was their shield, their precision, their pride. One of the earliest raids in September 1942 proved what the Mosquito could do. The target was the Gestapo headquarters in Oslo, Norway, a heavily guarded building in the center of the city. The Germans believed it untouchable. Anti-aircraft guns ringed the capital, and Luftwaffe fighters patrolled the skies daily. But that morning, a pair of mosquitoes skimmed in from the sea at wave-top height, crossing Norway's fjords so low that fishermen looked down on them from their boats. At exactly 1100 a.m., the lead pilot released his bombs. They hit the building dead center, destroying vital records and killing dozens of Gestapo officers. Every German fighter in southern Norway scrambled to pursue them. None got close. The Mosquitoes were already halfway home, streaking back across the North Sea. That single strike forced the Luftwaffe to divert fighter units from the front lines to defend its own cities, a humiliation Hitler never forgot. A year later came the mission that stunned even Britain's own commanders, Operation Jericho, the Amiens prison raid. February 18th, 1944. The same day, the Mosquitoes would later bomb Berlin. In northern France, over 100 members of the French resistance were awaiting execution in Amiens prison. RAF intelligence knew they would be shot within 48 hours. The only way to save them was to break the walls literally. 14 Mosquitoes of the 464th and 487th Squadrons took off from England, flying through freezing rain and heavy cloud. Their orders were precise: destroy the prison walls and guards' quarters, but leave the prisoners' wings standing. The formation crossed the French coast at rooftop level, their wingtips slicing through morning fog. Towns flashed by below them in seconds, church spires, schoolyards, roads. Civilians barely had time to look up. At 1200 sharp, the lead Mosquito dropped its bombs. The blast tore open the outer wall. Moments later, the second wave hit the main gate. Inmates began running through the smoke as the British bombers pulled away, skimming the treetops back to England. One aircraft was shot down, but the mission succeeded. More than 200 prisoners escaped. Many would later rejoin the resistance. The German communique called it a ruthless act of terrorism. But across occupied Europe, whispers spread of something else, a machine of wood and speed that could strike anywhere and vanish like a ghost. By now, the Luftwaffe's frustration had turned to fury. Goering himself ordered a detailed investigation into how Britain was building an aircraft that defied logic. German engineers couldn't understand it. How could a plane made from plywood outrun a fighter made of aluminum? They tried to imitate the design, but lacked the specialized glues and the craftsmen who could shape wood with the precision of instrument makers. Even their industrial philosophy, mass production standardization, made it impossible to reproduce the artistry of the Mosquito. Meanwhile, the raids grew bolder. Mosquitoes bombed Gestapo offices in The Hague and Copenhagen radar stations along the French coast, even the Berlin Broadcasting Tower, all in daylight. In January 1943, two mosquitoes attacked the Berlin radio station precisely as Hermann Goering was scheduled to deliver a live speech. The bombs fell seconds before he took the microphone. His voice never reached the airwaves. The propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, was livid. German morale plummeted. How could the mighty Reich master of Europe be mocked by wooden aircraft from across the channel? The Luftwaffe began assigning elite fighter units specifically to hunt mosquitoes. They failed. The German Bf 109 seconds and Fvu 190 seconds could barely reach the mosquitoes' cruising altitude, and even when they did, the British aircraft's acceleration was astonishing. In level flight, it could reach 415 miles per hour faster than most interceptors at the time. German pilots reported a maddening experience. They'd spot a tiny silhouette ahead dive at full throttle and watch it pull away, as if gravity itself favored the British. One ace described it bitterly in his diary. "We were lions chasing ghosts." What made the mosquito terrifying wasn't just its speed, it was its precision. Most bombers relied on mass formations and area bombing. The mosquito didn't need to. It could strike a single building, a single bridge, a single train. In 1943 alone, mosquito crews destroyed more than 500 locomotives, 1000 trucks, and countless supply depots. They became the eyes and the scalpel of the Allied air war, cutting with surgical accuracy while the heavy bombers delivered the hammer blows. Even the U.S. 8th Air Force began using mosquitoes as pathfinders, leading huge formations of B-17 seconds to their targets through cloud and smoke. To the Allies, it was proof that intelligence and agility could do what brute strength could not. To the Germans, it was a nightmare that no amount of firepower could end. By late 1943, Goering could only watch as his once dominant Luftwaffe was bled white. Every squadron sent to chase mosquitoes returned with the same report: too fast, too high, too late. He would later tell a captured British officer, half in admiration, half in despair, "I turn green with envy when I see the mosquito. The British make beautiful things and we, the Germans, make nice toys." It was the most reluctant compliment of the war, an admission that the age of heavy armored machines was over and the age of innovation had begun. The mosquito had started as a rejected experiment, a wooden oddity built by furniture makers. Now it was rewriting the laws of air warfare. Every time its shadow passed over a German city, it carried a single message carved into the sound of its engines. No fortress is safe. No arrogance is invincible. And for the first time, the men of the Luftwaffe began to wonder whether the war in the air had already been lost. By early 1944, the de Havilland Mosquito had become more than a weapon. It was a legend whispered through both Allied and Axis ranks. In British mess halls, pilots spoke of it with pride and affection. In German intelligence reports, it was described with frustration, disbelief, and fear. To the British, it was the wooden wonder. To the Germans, it had earned a far darker name, Der Holzgeist, the wooden ghost. February 18th, 1944. Berlin. The city was still rebuilding from the previous winter's raids, its citizens weary from the endless howl of sirens. That morning, clouds hung low over the capital, and the Luftwaffe's radar station scanned the empty sky. Nothing unusual appeared. But what came next would humiliate the Third Reich in a way that bombs alone never could. At 1100 a.m., two mosquitoes from No. 105 Squadron, Royal Air Force, crossed the German border at treetop height. Their mission to strike Berlin in broad daylight as a symbolic blow to Nazi pride. In the cockpit of the lead aircraft, squadron leader Ted Sismore studied his map as the landscape blurred beneath him. Beside him, Flight Lieutenant Reggie Reynolds steadied the controls. Their Mosquito, painted in dull gray camouflage, seemed to melt into the winter haze. At 400 miles per hour, they raced east, skimming the snow-covered fields of northern Germany. Towns flashed by in seconds. Church steeples became blurs. Even the flight crews didn't have time to react. By the time they looked up, the aircraft were gone. Crossing the Oder River, Reynolds adjusted the throttle. Ahead lay the heart of the Reich. At precisely 1101A, the Mosquitoes roared over Berlin. Their first target, the Berlin Broadcasting Station, the same one Hermann Goering was using to deliver a national address marking the 10th anniversary of the Luftwaffe. The timing was perfect. As Goering prepared to speak, the ground shook. The building's windows shattered inward. The radio broadcast cut to static. Before German anti-aircraft guns could even open fire, the second Mosquito struck, dropping 2 bombs onto the Gestapo headquarters nearby. The entire raid lasted less than a minute. By the time the Luftwaffe scrambled interceptors, the Mosquitoes were already halfway back to the North Sea. Berlin had just been bombed in daylight by 2 planes made of wood. In London, the news electrified the British press. The Times called it a precision strike that defied the laws of war. In Berlin, Goering was incandescent with rage. Witnesses recalled him storming through air ministry corridors, shouting at subordinates. "What do you expect me to do?" he roared. "Build our own wooden planes." The Mosquito had done more than damage buildings, it had destroyed Germany's illusion of control. If British bombers could hit Berlin in daylight and escape untouched, what else could they do? The psychological effect was devastating. One Luftwaffe officer wrote in his diary that night, "Our radar saw nothing. Our fighters saw nothing. Only the explosions proved it was real." But the Berlin raid was just the beginning. In the weeks that followed, Mosquitoes struck again and again. They bombed Gestapo offices in Denmark, Norway, and the Netherlands. They raided railway lines, fuel depots, airfields, anything that could cripple the German war machine. They even pioneered night intruder missions, slipping into enemy airspace under cover of darkness, hunting returning German bombers as they tried to land. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin by losses on the Eastern Front, had no answer. By mid-1944, the Mosquito had become the backbone of Britain's Pathfinder force, the elite squadrons that guided thousands of heavy bombers to their targets with pinpoint accuracy. They marked enemy positions with flares, illuminated cities for night raids, and photographed the aftermath, all while flying at speeds that made them almost untouchable. To the men who flew it, the Mosquito felt alive, a creature of speed and instinct. Pilot Jeffrey Panton, who served in 109 Squadron, would later recall, "You didn't fight the Mosquito. You danced with it. It responded to your thoughts before you even moved the stick." Its twin Rolls-Royce Merlins howled in perfect harmony, a sound that struck fear into anyone who heard it overhead. German soldiers learned to recognize that note, a high-pitched shriek that meant death was seconds away. Even as Allied bombing intensified, Goering remained obsessed with the Mosquito. He demanded reports on every encounter, convinced that the British must be using some secret technology, a new kind of radar, an undiscovered alloy. When he finally saw a captured Mosquito fuselage, he was stunned. It wasn't metal at all, just thin layers of polished birch and balsa joined with glue and paint. No armor, no heavy rivets, no sophisticated systems, just wood and brilliance. He is reported to have muttered almost in disbelief. The British turn out a beautiful wooden aircraft, and it does everything we cannot. The Luftwaffe tried to respond. They deployed their fastest interceptors, including the new Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter. For a brief moment, it seemed the jet might finally end the Mosquito's reign, but it came too late and in too few numbers. The Mosquito had already changed the war. It had redefined what a bomber could be, not a lumbering fortress, but a scalpel. When the first Me 262 seconds appeared over Germany in late 1944, Mosquito pilots were already flying reconnaissance over the Rhine, photographing bridgeheads for the Allied invasion. Even the jets could rarely catch them. The Mosquito's climb rate and agility kept it one step ahead even against the future. By the end of 1944, the aircraft once dismissed as a joke had become a nightmare for the Reich. Mosquito squadrons were striking targets across occupied Europe daily, with losses far lower than any other bomber unit in history. From 1941 to 1945, over 7700 Mosquitoes were built, serving in every major theater of the war. They conducted over 28000 missions from Berlin to Burma with unmatched precision and success. Even the men who fought against it couldn't help but admire it. A captured Luftwaffe colonel reportedly told his interrogators, "The Mosquito, that was not an aircraft. It was a miracle. The wooden plane that everyone had mocked had done the impossible. It outflew Hitler's best pilots, humiliated the Luftwaffe, and proved that imagination could outpace fear. In a war defined by machines of metal and fire, it was a creation of wood and faith that truly embodied the spirit of defiance." The Mosquito wasn't just fast. It was freedom built from the hands of artists, flown by men of courage and powered by a belief that intelligence could triumph over tyranny. And as 1944 turned to 1945, its roar above the clouds carried a message to every soldier, pilot, and citizen who heard it. Even in the darkest times, the mind will always fly faster than fear. Inside Germany, the legend of the Mosquito began to spread like a whispered confession, a truth no one wanted to speak aloud. The Reich had built its pride on the myth of technological superiority, on machines of steel and precision that no enemy could match. And yet the terror that haunted its skies was not born in a factory of iron, but in a carpenter's workshop across the sea. For the men of the Luftwaffe, the realization was painful, almost humiliating. They had grown up believing they were the masters of the airs, to von Richthofen, soldiers of an invincible air arm. Now they were chasing shadows made of wood. In a letter written in late 1944, Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Roeder described his first encounter with the Mosquito. "We were flying patrol near Bremen when radar reported a contact. We climbed to intercept full throttle. Then I saw it, a gray shape ahead, moving like no aircraft I'd ever seen. I pushed the throttle until my engine screamed. The gap did not close, it simply left us behind." He ended his report with words that echoed across every fighter squadron. "We can fight men. We cannot fight mathematics." That was the heart of it. The Mosquito's advantage wasn't just speed. It was numbers, the cold arithmetic of efficiency. Each one cost a fraction of what Germany spent on its Me 410 seconds, or Ju 88 seconds. It required fewer men, less fuel, less maintenance, and yet for every Mosquito lost, it could destroy targets worth hundreds of times its own value. Even the Luftwaffe's senior commanders began to understand what was happening. Hermann Goering, who had once promised the German people that no enemy bomb would ever fall on Berlin, was now haunted by those very bombs. Small, precise, and delivered by aircraft his own defenses could not touch. Captured documents after the war revealed his frustration. In one memo he wrote, "The British have achieved something we refuse to believe possible. They are turning speed and simplicity into strategy." Another entry was even more bitter. "The Mosquito is proof that the British genius is not in machines, but in imagination." For the Luftwaffe's engineers, the humiliation was technical as much as emotional. They had tried to build their own answer, the Me 410 Hornisse, a twin-engine heavy fighter meant to hunt the Mosquito. It was faster than most bombers armed with cannon and armor. But against the Mosquito, it was useless. The wooden aircraft was lighter, nimbler, and far more efficient. Where the German plane needed perfect airfields and constant maintenance, the Mosquito could take off from muddy strips in the English countryside and be gone before radar even woke up. One frustrated German designer was recorded saying, "They build airplanes the way we build violins. We build ours like tanks." Pilots on the ground felt that difference every day. At night, mosquitoes prowled over occupied France and the Rhineland, attacking trains, bridges, and convoys. They seemed to appear from nowhere, a flash of twin lights, the scream of engines, and then explosions rolling through the darkness. In Hamburg, civilians began calling them Gespensterflieger, ghost planes. To them, it felt as if the British had learned how to make their aircraft invisible. By late 1944, Luftwaffe night fighter crews were breaking under the pressure. One squadron leader wrote in his diary, "We sit in our cockpits waiting for orders, and they strike wherever they please. How can you stop an enemy who does not play by your rules?" Even Hitler himself noticed the psychological toll. Reports reached him that German workers refused to leave shelters during daylight, convinced the wooden bombers could appear at any moment. He raged at Goering, demanding retaliation. But there was none to give. Factories were bombed faster than they could repair, fuel was running out, and the skies over Germany were no longer German. In one of his final conferences, Goering spoke with a tone of resignation that none of his aides had ever heard before. "They beat us not with numbers, but with ideas." The Mosquito has shown that we are no longer the future, we are the past. The awareness spread quietly through every rank of the Luftwaffe, from mechanics to generals. They realized that what had begun as a small British experiment had grown into a symbol of a new kind of war, a war where creativity mattered more than metal, where a handful of daring men could humiliate an empire built on arrogance. By the winter of 1945, Germany's air defense network was collapsing. Radar stations burned. Supply trains were shattered before dawn. And every time a faint buzzing rose in the distance, German soldiers would look to the sky and mutter one word: mosquito. It was more than a plane now. It was a reminder of everything the Reich had underestimated: the quiet defiance of free people, the power of imagination, and the truth that genius can come from the unlikeliest of places, even from a wooden workshop in a bombed-out English town. For the men who built it, the Mosquito was proof that hope could fly. For the men who fought against it, it was the moment they understood the war in the air was already lost. When the war finally turned against the Reich, the de Havilland Mosquito had already written its legacy in smoke and thunder across the skies of Europe. It wasn't just another aircraft, it was proof that imagination, not industry, had won the battle for the air. Between 1941 and 1945, over 7700, Mosquitoes were built in more than 30 different versions: bombers, night fighters, reconnaissance planes, pathfinders, even trainers. Each one began life not in a massive steel factory, but in small workshops scattered across Britain: furniture, plants, cabinet shops, even piano factories converted for war. At the height of production, one Mosquito rolled off the line every hour. And while most aircraft needed aluminum, copper, and iron materials in short supply, the Mosquito thrived on wood, a resource Britain still had in abundance. It was the perfect weapon for a nation that refused to surrender even when the odds said it should. In combat, its record was unmatched. The Mosquito completed over 28000 missions from Berlin to Burma with the lowest loss rate of any bomber in the Royal Air Force, less than one aircraft for every 100 sorties. It was faster than any German interceptor for nearly the entire war. And when the Me-262 jet finally appeared, the Mosquito was already flying at altitudes and speeds that still made interception difficult. The numbers told the story. It could carry a 4,000-pound cookie bomb, the same payload as a B-17 Flying Fortress. It required only 2 crewmen instead of 10. It burned half the fuel, flew twice as fast, and could return home before German radar even realized it had crossed the channel. Even the Allied commanders who had doubted it came to rely on it completely. Marshal Arthur Harris of Bomber Command, a man famous for his obsession with heavy bombers, admitted, "The Mosquito turned out to be the most versatile aircraft ever built." Its missions became the stuff of legend. It led precision daylight raids against Gestapo headquarters in Copenhagen and The Hague, destroying archives that contained the names of resistance fighters, saving countless lives. It struck the prison at Amiens, freeing men and women who had thought they would die behind those walls. It guided massive formations of Lancasters through the night sky, marking enemy cities with flares so the heavy bombers could follow. It hunted submarines, sank ships, destroyed trains, and photographed the entire European front, every bridge, every airfield, every secret base. In Burma, mosquitoes operated from jungle clearings outrunning Japanese fighters just as easily as they had outflown the Luftwaffe. In Italy, they chased Axis convoys across the Mediterranean. Everywhere it went, it adapted fast, flexible, fearless. But beyond the victories and the numbers, the mosquito's greatest achievement was what it symbolized. In a world consumed by machines of war, by tanks, bombers, and rockets, the mosquito was a reminder that ingenuity could still triumph over terror. It wasn't built by generals or politicians. It was built by craftsmen, by engineers, by ordinary men and women who refused to believe that limits were permanent, and it carried that spirit into every mission. When a mosquito pilot climbed into the cockpit, he knew that his armor wasn't steel, it was speed. His defense wasn't guns, it was precision. He flew not by brute force, but by faith in what human hands and minds could achieve together. When victory finally came in 1945, the world looked at the mosquito differently. The Americans had their flying fortresses, the Germans had their jet fighters, but the British had something simpler and in many ways greater. The mosquito had done everything the others had done and more, with half the weight, half the crew, and half the cost. It had embarrassed an empire built on arrogance and inspired a generation of designers to think differently. In the years that followed, its influence could be seen everywhere in jet bombers, reconnaissance planes, and even the first jet fighters. It had proven that the future of warfare didn't belong to the biggest machine, but to the smartest one. As the last Mosquito squadron stood down after the war, their pilots gathered one final time. They looked at the aircraft that had carried them through the fire, its wooden skin scarred by flak, its engines still gleaming in the sun. It looked fragile, almost too beautiful for war. One veteran touched its fuselage and whispered, "You never let us down." He was right. Through every mission, every danger, every impossible order, the Mosquito had done what no one believed it could do. It survived. It had begun as a rejected dream, a fantasy made of glue and plywood. It ended as one of the most successful combat aircraft in history. In a war defined by steel and blood, the Mosquito proved that the most powerful weapon of all was imagination. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the world tried to count the cost. Cities reduced to ash nations, in ruins, millions of lives lost. But among the wreckage of the most destructive war in human history, there were also stories of creation, of courage, of invention, of human brilliance, refusing to be buried under fear. The de Havilland Mosquito was one of them. It began as a question whispered in the darkness of England's most desperate hour. What if speed could replace armor? What if ingenuity could defeat arrogance? And from that question, a miracle took flight, a miracle made of wood glue and the unshakable faith that freedom would find a way. Every nation that fought in World War II built machines to destroy, but Britain built one to remind the world of what it was fighting for. The Mosquito was more than a weapon. It was an idea. It was proof that imagination could outrun tyranny, that precision could outmatch brutality, and that even in a time of total war creation could still be an act of defiance. When those twin Merlin engines screamed through the sky, they carried more than bombs. They carried a message that intelligence, artistry, and human will could still soar above the noise of hate. For the men who built it, the Mosquito was personal. Many were civilians, woodworkers, cabinet makers, piano builders, who traded their tools of beauty for the tools of survival. They worked under air raid sirens and blackout curtains, carving wings while German bombers thundered overhead. They didn't know if their homes would be standing in the morning, but they built anyway. Every piece of wood, every joint of glue was an act of quiet rebellion. It said, "You can bomb our cities, but you cannot destroy our creativity." And for the pilots who flew it, young men barely out of school, the Mosquito was freedom itself. They flew into enemy territory with nothing but speed and nerve between them and death. They raced through tracer fire so fast that anti-aircraft gunners barely had time to aim. They struck and vanished, leaving only silence and disbelief behind. Those who survived never forgot the sound of those engines, that deep rising hum that meant the impossible was about to happen again. After the war, most Mosquitoes were scrapped, their wooden bodies burned or broken apart for parts. But for the men who had built them, flown them, or watched them streak across the sky, the memory never faded. Because the Mosquito had proven something larger than victory, it had proven what human beings were capable of when everything else had been taken away. It had shown that even when a nation was cornered, outnumbered, and running out of resources, creativity could still be infinite. That a handful of dreamers armed with nothing but vision and conviction could change the course of a war and humiliate an empire. In 1946, at a quiet ceremony in Hatfield, Geoffrey de Havilland stood beside one of the last Mosquitoes built. He was older now, his hair silvered by years of doubt, loss, and triumph. He placed his hand on the wooden fuselage, smooth, light, and perfect, and whispered something only those close to him could hear. They said it couldn't be done. He was right. They had said it again and again. And yet, it had been done. The story of the Mosquito isn't just about an airplane. It's about the endurance of the human spirit, the belief that brilliance can be born from scarcity, that beauty can exist even in war, and that sometimes the simplest ideas carry the most power. In a world obsessed with destruction, the Mosquito was creation. In an age of steel and fear, it was art. And in the darkest years of the 20th century, it reminded the world that even the smallest miracle built by human hands, shaped by courage and born of imagination, can change the course of history. The de Havilland Mosquito, the wooden miracle that outsmarted Hitler's empire and proved that no wall of steel can ever hold back the flight of human genius.